Well, hi everyone. This is Roger Horowitz of the Hadley Museum and Library. I'm here for another episode of Hadley History Hangout, where we talk to people who have been doing such interesting research in the collections of our library and archives there, in part so that you get to know the wonderful work that's done here, and also so you think about what you might be able to research in our collections. With me today is Brent Cebul, an old friend who's done a great deal of research at Hagley and given papers here and published papers through our various means here. He is now assistant professor at the University of Pennsylvania, and he's come to talk to us about his new book, Illusions of Progress, Business, Poverty, and Liberalism in the American Century. Brent, thanks for coming in and joining us.
Thank you so much, and thank you to Hagley for all the resources and support over the years. It truly was one of the really significant sort of repositories and proving grounds for some of the ideas that became this book. So I'm really grateful to be able to share some of my findings with this community.
We'll come back to that. I'm going to ask you to say more about that, but first, let's get to the book there, Illusions of Progress. Very simple question to start off with. Why did you write this book? What inspired you? I mean, yes, I know you were in a PhD program, that's what you do, but more than that, what were the questions that motivated you to embark on this project? Folks who are watching may know that when you write a dissertation and you produce a book, it's over a decade, a lot of investment in a particular project there. So what motivated you to want to do this kind of a project for a dissertation in a book?
Yeah, so I grew up in Cleveland, which is one of the sort of threads that I weave through the book, the sort of history of Cleveland, Ohio in the 20th century. And I sort of came of age in the 1990s in Cleveland, when Cleveland was sort of known as the comeback city. It was the place that the New York Times and the Wall Street Journal, Harvard Business School did case studies of the public-private partnerships in Cleveland, and how this sort of civically engaged set of business people, top attorneys, real estate interests, some of the bankers in the city had sort of led the city's recovery from the nadir of deindustrialization in the 60s, 70s, and 80s. And we had new stadiums and towers and things like that. And I was initially quite sort of enchanted by the sort of booster mythos of the 1990s. But as I sort of aged out of that, I realized that that was only captured a very small sliver of what was happening downtown, and that the sort of rising tide was not lifting all the boats in the city, as we say. And so I was interested in that as sort of a political question about, how do we actually solve problems at the urban level? And then at the same time, we had this first wave of scholarship by scholars like Kim Phillips-Fein and Angus Bergen on the sort of anti-statist strain of business politics, which seemed decisively not the case of what my business people were doing in Cleveland. And so I was interested in this sort of where did the sort of civic spiritedness and how do we situate that in the broader sort of historiographical questions of liberalism and conservatism and business history? And so that really was sort of one of the things that propelled me into this project was how do we sort of account for this very different and local form of business politics that contrasted pretty sharply with what we were hearing about, sort of national Koch brothers style politics.
Well, for those who aren't familiar with literature, I mean, what Brent's referring to is a sort of consensus among academics that this neoliberalism, as you might call it, moved away from reliance on the state. In a short, that's the direction of that, and people like Kim Phillips-Fein mentioned spent a lot of time trolling through archives for correspondence with people who engaged in this effort to reduce welfare, the welfare society in America. So that didn't work for you, I gather. That argument really didn't sit right with you.
Well, so one of the things that was interesting, and one of the puzzles that I sort of worked through, is that as I got into local archives of chambers of commerce records, who are sort of the key sort of organizational means by which my business people are affecting city politics and federal policy as well, was that they very often did speak in ways that sounded rather like, the national business elites of the Liberty League from the 30s and 40s, and, sort of Koch brothers style frustration with big government. But they often mobilized that way of speaking in order to justify their control over government programs, to sort of say, oh, if the state does this, it's going to be inefficient, it's going to be wasteful, it's going to go to other areas that don't need these subsidies, these developmental programs, these anti-poverty programs. But if we manage them, if we have control over them, they'll be much more efficiently and effectively run. And so I saw a sort of kindred, and anti-statist discourse, but it was actually mobilized on behalf of more privileged access to the state, rather than rolling it back.
Well, my reaction to that is in history, one of our old saws is change or continuity, and the Philip Fine scholarship, again, great stuff,
Yeah.
argues for change, that a change takes place. There's an earlier book by Gary Gersel, The End of the New Deal Order, or that's a new book, and then The Making of the New Deal Order. This sort of notion that Reagan's election marks a break, and you're really arguing, you really have the continuity argument going on here.
Yeah, and it stretches back even further than I think the book itself. I mean, one of the things that I look at is like, how in fact did the New Deal instantiate itself? How did these works programs operate? And one of the real crises facing the Roosevelt administration in the 1930s when it came in was simply one of capacity. Like, how do we create agencies that fan out across the country? And what they realized pretty quickly was that you couldn't do this in a relatively centralized way. And both politically, but then also just in terms of pragmatism. And what they recognized, and this is really, I thought the project was going to be sort of a post-60s project about sort of neoliberalism in a certain way, and the archives drew me back. And what you find instead is that the sort of progressive era rise of chambers of commerce, in 1929, there's more than 1,500 chambers of commerce operating in communities all across the country. And they were affiliated with, key actors who moved into the New Deal, people like Harold Ickes and Charles Merriam, who recognized in these local business elites a sort of civic spiritedness that they could tap into as sponsors and administrators of New Deal works programs. The idea that you might, in Cleveland, in the 1930s, the head of the Cuyahoga County Works Progress Administration was an out-of-work railroad executive who hired 400, out-of-work white-collar architects and engineers and draftsmen to come in and sort of determine what all that New Deal subsidized labor was going to do in ways that would be economically useful for the city. And so there's a way in which the business elites became sort of constitutive parts of the New Deal in ways that I don't think the sort of the Gersel generation of scholarship, which is excellent, sort of focused on a sort of centralizing moment. And I think two things can be true at once. There's a sort of federal authority that's emerging, but it's operating through localism, through decentralization, through the administrative capacities and interests of these public-private partnerships that were sort of how urban governments function all the way back. And what's happening in the 1930s is they're being incorporated into the federal government in really novel ways.
Well, this can stretch back to the 19th century, actually. Local boost system efforts to do that there. I mean, you don't want to get into this in your book, because you deal with plenty of scholarship, but the whole American political development, sociology, political science, I think it's Stephen Scotchpole, Stephen Skowronek, makes the case that one of the reasons the U.S. is a weak welfare state, though that's a question. The chart is that the state didn't have administrative capacity to actually do programs. The example, which of course is always sweet. I'm not necessarily boosting that literature. There's a lot to be said about that, but it seems you fastened on to the problem of capacity. How to take these programs there, and one of the obvious ways is you decentralize them.
That's right, and one of the things that happens over the course of the New Deal, of course, there by 1937, 1938, Congress is sort of it's not becoming more conservative, but it's becoming, less interested in some of the grand centralized experimentation of the first administration in particular. And what I mentioned Charles Merriam and other members of the National Resources Planning Board, who really did want to create a more sort of centralized and regional basis of economic planning that might supersede the sort of pragmatic partnerships that I talked about a minute ago, realized that they're not going to be able to get that system through Congress. And it is in a very real way, and I hope the first few chapters of the book make this clear, that it is the local business elites, these chambers of commerce, who carry forward the New Deal vision of regional and local economic planning in partnership with the federal government. It's during World War II and after that these business people are going to their members of Congress, that they're seeking subsidies for planning, for infrastructure development, for housing. And so there's a real way in which the sort of initial burst of New Deal spending sort of catalyzes a movement of business people all across the country to plug into the federal government, especially across the South, where, in Georgia, as I show, there's just marked capital scarcity. And so these business people who have been toiling to get levees and roads built, all of a sudden have Uncle Sam to turn to for the spending. And so they create all sorts of new planning agencies and economic development organizations to really carry forward a vision of developmentalism, shorn in some ways of the New Deal social aspirations, but that's one that liberals are very much on board with.
Yeah, the South is particularly interesting here because this is, again, if I can throw another name at some of the people watching, the Ira Katznelson has argued especially effectively that one of the big breaks in the New Deal was the South. That the Democrats had a majority, yes, but a lot of that majority were in southern states in which African Americans were disenfranchised. So you had to placate the southern interest, and he sees them basically as retrograde. By and large, he doesn't get into the great stuff, but still doesn't get into those elite issues. So what does this do to the South? I mean, it sounds like, is there warfare or political warfare in the South between elites as this money starts flowing down the pipeline?
Warfare, I think, would overstate it, because what's happening is that there's a new sort of business politics that's emerging across the South that is, compared to the sort of courthouse Jim Crow style politics that went before, is certainly more moderate in certain ways. I think I'm aligned in certain ways with Joe Crispino's first book about Mississippi, and the ways in which the sort of the quest for a more sort of modern politics that could sort of manage Jim Crow in certain ways without the sort of excesses of the violence, very much is what my business elites are looking for. And so they're trying to sort of surpass the austerity and corruption of the old sort of county courthouse gangs that operated across the South, and they do so in fits and starts, and with sort of new South politicians, people, Jimmy Carter emerges as a sort of central figure in the book as somebody who is trying to sort of straddle the fence of old style segregationist politics, but is decisively forward looking, and what Southern Democrats and business people, they call themselves progressives, not in the sense of like the progressive movement, but as what we're after is economic progress. And so there's a sort of moderate politics that's emerging across the South that's still very much it's facilitated by the maintenance of Jim Crow. It's easier to implement their economic development schemes because the South is a sort of apartheid state, and there's less democratic accountability for their planning. But it's less willing to participate in the excesses of and violence of the older Jim Crow regimes.
Well, your use of progressive reminds me of, again, another recent work. Again, this is what happens when you write about the business of the state. You have always had these stuff that we talk about. But Jennifer Delton wrote a book about the National Association of Manufacturers a few years ago, in which she takes, I think, a controversial stand, but I found persuasive, that NAM was progressive. Not in the sense of being a progressive movement for social change and so on and so forth, the way we might mean today, but progressive in a business sense, for modernizing things, and NAM, and she charts how NAM becomes a supporter of the New Deal state by the 1950s rather than against it, because it was all this money rolling down. And hey, that's going to be good for business.
Yeah, and I think one of the things that I think is the case is that, and this is something that Daniel Bell and others were writing about, is we tend to think of say economic planning as sort of anathema in the American system when we contrast it with Stalin's 5-year plans or something like that. But part of what's happening is that business organizations are not only doing the planning themselves, which is of course what Galbraith and Bell are talking about, but they're doing so in partnership with local, regional, and federal authorities. And I think one of the things, and actually this was really one of the more important finds for me, is that it's in the 1970s and 1980s that NAM sort of breaks with that more sort of pragmatic politics, and they do so at the cost of members and membership. One of the key sort of turns in the story is that in the 1970s, you've got the Powell memo, you've got the sort of concerns about the new bureaucratic and regulatory class coming in, and there's a sort of a harder edge to business politics. But at the local level, business people who are struggling with the industrialization and global economic shifts are really expecting the federal government to step in with subsidies, with support for labor training, infrastructure, all sorts of things. And what happens is NAM conducts a series of polls of its members, and what they find is that that's what the members want, and what the organization has begun to do in the 1970s to start advocating for these more sort of abstract principles of free markets. And they lost many members as a result of that more sort of harder edged, Koch brothers style anti-statist politics. And this is sort of a thing I traced forward into the Reagan administration. The Reagan administration holds a series of symposia and workshops with business people all across the country to sell their vision of enterprise zones, right? These are these targeted tax and regulatory havens in cities that they say are going to drive private investment and stimulate all sorts of new businesses. And all these business people say, no business has ever started because of an absence of taxes or regulations, right? What we need are subsidies, we need labor, we need a cooperative political climate, we need infrastructure. And the Reagan administration, their aides sort of prepare memos that sort of go nowhere as they send them up the chain of command, and instead they sort of double down on the sort of ideological vision of doing away with those types of sort of more purist vision of state market interaction, and that is not at all what defined those public-private partnerships for most of the 20th century.
I mean, this is going even further outside your book, but here's a question. Is this an argument against American exceptionalism? I mean, the exceptionalist argument is that America, unlike the Western countries, doesn't have a strong welfare state. Business is more dominant and all that. And, and of course, and I said before, it's joking that Sweden is the example, but France and Britain and Germany, that's kind of the standard. And then there's the US, which kind of, that's a weak welfare state, is weak sort. And you're kind of saying, well, actually, the state is terrifically important in American political development. It's not a weak state argument.
I think that's right, and I think the way that I would sort of finesse the point is that we liberals, conservatives, business people had a very difficult time coming up with, and this is where the exceptionalist thing is sort of a cultural trope that goes all the way back. They have a hard time naming and claiming the types of developmental partnerships they're building, and instead come up with all sorts of other ways of describing, well, we're going to deliver these subsidies on behalf of fighting World War II. We're going to do it on behalf of military contracting in the Cold War. This is where the sort of poverty lens comes in. We're doing it as these targeted bursts to solve problems of affordable housing or of lack of jobs in certain communities, or rural poverty in Appalachia. And what happens is that each time these programs are framed themselves as rather exceptional and fleeting. But when you sort of pull the lens back, what you see is that this, what I call supply side liberalism, is a remarkably durable form of state market interaction, state sculpting of markets, working with business people to try to create downstream social goods. And what I would say is that the reason they emerged in this sort of ad hoc way was because of a sort of acceptance of the constitutional structure of fiscal federalism, right? And this is sort of one of the themes running through the book, is that liberals didn't really want to create robust federal programs that would have to have appropriations year after year. And instead, what they decided to do was to send these targeted bursts of subsidies, insurance for housing, to the local level in ways that might stimulate growth that could create local fiscal capacity, so local governments could do these things over time. And so there's a way in which the sort of the rapprochement with the constitutional structure itself sort of reinforces the tropes of American exceptionalism and sort of consensus, but lurking behind that is just robust state action everywhere you go. It's just more ad hoc than formalized.
I mean, and really, I mean, tracing that back deep into the progressive era, it would seem to me. I mean, Charles Merriam, who you met, who's a big player in your story, and he's active in the Chicago plan,
Absolutely.
which recreates downtown Chicago in the 1920s and 30s to generate a much more business-friendly loop area. So, I mean, you don't need to do this in your story, but I'm saying that this actually extends back probably to the progressive era, and the progressives trying to create partnerships to engage in economic development.
Absolutely. No, there's no question. And I actually, one of my mentors on this project sort of urged me to take the story back into the 1880s and 1890s, but it was already too long. So I sort of gesture at that through figures like Merriam, who was not only the first political scientist at the University of Chicago, but was a member of the Chicago City Council, was a Republican, worked very closely, as you mentioned, with Frederick Delano, Franklin Roosevelt's uncle, on some of these harbor plans. He works on getting the city out of its municipal debt crises in the teens and 20s. And these are all orientations toward public and private interaction that he's going to bring with him into the National Resources Planning Board as its sort of chief theorist. Yeah.
Right. I mean, if Richard White was sitting here, he'd say, "Hey, the railroads."
Absolutely. Absolutely.
Yeah. So in other words, I mean, this is one. I see this as a continuity argument. I mean, obviously things change, in the 20th century, but you're making an argument about the enduring nature of the American federal state. That look at the federal government is insufficient for understanding the importance of the state, in the economy. And William Novak's made this point about the early part of the 19th century. So it's a big argument. It seems to me that you're making. Of course, you have to, to find only the 30s to the 90s. I mean, several cities and. It's a lot of stuff to cover there, but it seems a very intriguing argument to avoid this kind of exceptionalism, not necessarily American exception, but exceptionalism of the New Deal, or the great exception, as Jefferson Cowie has put it. You're saying not so much when it comes to that.
Well, and that's and one of the things that I sort of grapple with is this, and sad to say, I'm at bottom a policy historian, and so what I'm really interested in is the sort of administration of the programs themselves. And so while Gary Gersel in his recent book on the rise and fall of the neoliberal order sort of posits that there was this consensus, that's his word, around big centralized government. And pretty much everywhere I looked in these programs is lurking this sort of idea of decentralism, this idea of local partners in the private sector, of not creating enduring budget outlays. And so part of what I was trying to do was to sort of square the Rooseveltian rhetoric of the social welfare state, of the four freedoms, of the economic Bill of Rights, all of these things, with the actual ways that the liberal state is seeking to carry these things out. And it's in that distance between the two that I think the story really latches on to the historiography and sort of propels the case that some of the sort of neoliberal policy tools and orientations toward government themselves have a much longer history of being embedded in state practices, and as you've said, going back to the 19th century as well.
Now let's talk a little bit more about these businessmen who you're talking
yes.
about. So we have, I mean, who are these people? What are they? What do they do? Because these are your local actors, or not so local actors, but these are the people who are driving your story.
Yeah. So as I got into this, and this was something that I sort of figured out later on in the dissertation, and as I began to work on the book, was that there is a particular sort of genus or class of local business person, and these are not your industrial titans, your big manufacturers or textile elites. What they are largely the progenitors of the FIRE economy: finance, insurance, real estate, law. And these are business people whose bottom lines really do depend upon the broader health of their local economy. And so they are the ones who very often are doing the recruiting of the big manufacturing firms. They're the ones who are trying to bring capital into their community because the health of their bank or the real estate values or their law firm depends upon those connections. So part of what I do in the book is look at how, even though, Cleveland, Ohio, in the 1930s is, I think, the fifth biggest city in the country, there's a way in which, given their orientation to local economic development, their dependence upon local economic development, they end up acting in ways structurally very similar to some of the rural business boosters in the South. They have a sort of different cultural orientation and national political valence at first, but they go through a sort of remarkably similar process of kind of accommodating themselves to the New Deal and its spending really quickly. And in Cleveland's a really interesting case because these are all Republicans. These are all people who would have voted for Hoover, who are having to go to, U.S. Chamber of Commerce meetings where they're debating and decrying the New Deal. Some of them are the president. We had a president of the National Association of Manufacturers from Cleveland, and so they are discursively and I think instinctively anti, federal spending, anti-federal regulation, but they recognize pretty quickly that these spending programs have real benefits. And so part of what I try to do in a sort of subtle way through the book is make the case that they develop a certain sort of political cultural orientation to the state, which I borrow from sort of 19th century scholars of labor and agrarian politics of producerism. They justify their relationship to big federal spending in terms of the ways in which they become the producers of efficient federal programs, and through these programs they produce jobs for their community. And so there's a way in which they have to sort of justify their relationship with the state, so that they can sort of square their ideological predilections with the actual existing role that they're playing in growing government. And so that becomes a sort of story that I weave through throughout the book.
You call this business producerism.
Yeah.
Which is, I think, a very nice turn of phrase there because it captures both what their function, which is they are actually engaged in the local economy, but also there's a producerist ethos that they are producing for the entire community.
And this and one of the things that I think is a puzzle that we haven't fully grappled with in the sort of neoliberalism story is when did business people decide that their businesses themselves were socially good? That outside of the philanthropy that you might see, but that actually the businesses themselves as a model for the state and as a sort of active model for sort of local government. And that's a puzzle that I think the neoliberalism literature hadn't quite sorted out. And part of what I'm trying to show is that it's through the interaction with liberal development programs, liberal infrastructure programs, liberal housing programs, liberal anti-poverty programs, that business people not only learn to frame their state partnerships in these sort of progressive social ways, but they're required to. They have in their applications for these programs, they actually have to do an inventory of local poverty. They have to offer an index of how their management of these programs is actually going to benefit the least off. And so there's a process of learning that's happening here between local business people and the liberal state that I think produces the thing that Milton Friedman by 1970 is pulling his hair out. Like, what is this corporate social responsibility stuff? Like, where is this coming from? And I think we have a sort of short-term story about it's a response to the New Left, it's a response to the civil rights movement. But I think there's a much longer sort of genealogy of state business partnerships that's teaching business people to sort of frame their access to state subsidies and their profit seeking in progressive, quote unquote, progressive ways. And so that's a sort of key part of the business producerist ethos, and that I think helps explain, businesses' place in the sort of neoliberal moment as sort of, claimants to the social good.
Well, I mean, it's a Frank Capra. It's a Wonderful Life.
Yeah, that's exactly right.
Not in your bank. Well, it's Sam's store down the street. It's in this, that. The defense of this local elite is that they are investing in the community.
Absolutely. And one of the things that I think is really interesting too, like going back to the and this is, maybe really inside baseball for some listeners, but thinking about like Robert Weeby's work in The Search for Order, I mean, and C. Wright Mills and some of the early organizational synthesis scholars sort of viewed the 1920s and 1930s as the end of this sort of Babbittry, these local business people. And part of what I try to show is that, in fact, the New Deal in a very real way resuscitates their role both in the local civic space and as brokers of these momentous forms of federal power. And so, there's a way in which they could have gone the way of the dinosaur. And I think in some ways, by the end of my book, they have, but that has to do with much bigger sort of macro global economic forces, deregulation, these types of things. Yeah.
Yeah, we're walking through a lot of literature here, and apologies if you have read.
Yeah, right.
Robert Weeby's Search for Order is built upon the notion of the mind shop and a cell shop. You have locals and you have cosmopolitans, which is often an organizing principle in American history. And he argues that cosmopolitans eventually win out. Short story, longer book there. And,
Yeah.
and that's part of your story, is that inside the local areas, your local guys that maybe don't want to stay around, they get a grant program and look at the program and they go, millions of dollars for bridges. How would my business benefit from having a bridge that crosses from here to there and reduces the time, so on and so forth. It's obvious stuff for these local business people there. So the business people, they are not industrialists. Yes.
For the most part, there are some lurking around the fringe who have sort of, just sort of for personal reasons have sort of civic commitments to a community. But by and large, we're talking about lawyers, real estate interests. In the South, I have a number of sort of distributors, these types of things. I mean, who are really dependent upon utility officers, in electric utility firms. Like, I'm very interested in economic development and growth, right? Developing new customer bases. And so that's the sort of strata of business actor that I'm looking at.
In a way, these are business people more closely tied to consumption and to generating. Because that's what's going on in the local area. You want people to have money so they can buy things and do things, and have real estate policies. Buy houses. Put money in the local bank and all that. So I know that's not the major, sort of, if you will, motif of your book there. But there's a whole conversation about the importance of consumption and consumption as a way of driving economic growth in the New Deal and afterwards there. And these are not consumption people in that sense, but they just seem to me to be oriented towards the local area, whereas manufacturers who are, say, making bolts, and there are plants that are making bolts that are very right-wing, they're not selling the bolts in a local political economy. They're selling bolts to the auto companies. And so they're not part of that local set of concerns, even if they're living cheek to jowl to the people who are your Chamber of Commerce folks.
That's right, and I think one of the things that I would emphasize as well is that I think we in the political historical literature, we have this idea that there was this period of robust experimentation and centralization in the early New Deal that was creating cartels and setting prices and doing all of this work, and that by the end of the 1930s, that the New Dealers had recognized the power of economies of scale for driving down consumer prices. And that's the sort of macro story of the Keynesian growth liberalism story that Alan Brinkley and others have told. And part of what I'm trying to show here is that national story rested upon a firmament, of really robust targeted structural interventions in local markets. And so this idea that we had turned away from industrial policy, or we turned away from using government subsidies to drive innovation, that it was just about consumer demand, actually misses a really robust and durable form of state intervention in driving innovation and driving market developments, as a sort of symbiotic part of that.
Absolutely. I have more questions about that, but I don't want to take too long here. But let me ask you another direction that obviously you're very concerned about in the book, which is the implications of all this for working people and minorities. What does this mean? Of course, we think of the New Deal, and then of course the Great Society and all that as progress in that our contemporary sense, progress for working people, progress for racial minorities. How is your story engaged with that? What is the implications of your story for those groups?
Yeah, so this again is a sort of continuity story stretching back into the progressive era, right? I mean, you think about the ways in which the progressive era was about sort of reforming local governments, and sort of turning down the influence of, say, Tammany Hall, and sort of ethnic corruption, and moving to city managers and delivering democratic outcomes, but perhaps not doing so through mass democratic participation in certain ways, which is sort of a hallmark of the teens and 20s reformers. And part of what I try to show is that the structure of urban democracy, the structure of urban governance, the ways that the private is sort of calling the tune of local government, becomes a constitutive part of the federal government through the New Deal. And this was something that the NAACP recognized really early on. Like 1937, they're writing memos and urging the federal government to allow African Americans, to allow representatives of the NAACP to sort of sit on the local boards administering federal programs. They're sort of saying, like, we need what I call administrative enfranchisement in these new federal programs, which are harnessing the power of these local elites who are in bed with, are part of the Jim Crow state in the South, or part of the sort of the Jim Crow state of the North in certain ways. And they're saying, it's not enough to just have a federal works program. You need to actually incorporate a broader set of local people in the administration of these programs. And so I trace that story through using the archives of community activists, minority activists, and the key inflection point here then is the war on poverty of Lyndon Johnson and his community action programs, which actually did propose to create partnerships with minorities, with poor people themselves, public-private partnerships, and it's sort of a staggeringly radical concept if we think about it today. The idea that a local community group could apply to the federal government to create its own little jobs training program or a community center without having to go through local governments. And my business people and their allies in City Hall respond immediately by saying, whoa, these are not the kinds of public-private partnerships that the liberal state has been instantiating. And in fact, minority groups use these community action programs and the maximum feasible participation of the poor principle that they were authorized through to challenge these local hierarchies of power that business people and their allies and city governments had been able to entrench through partnership with liberal programs. And very quickly, I show that it's Lyndon Johnson who moves to end maximum feasible participation precisely by bringing business people back into the administration of these very programs. And then Nixon sort of finishes the job with his new federalism proposals. And so part of what I try to show is that there was a sort of, we have a sort of, New England town green vision of local democracy that, actors from Roosevelt to Reagan have invoked about the value of decentralism and localism and building consensus. Local people know best what their problems are, but we need to attend very carefully to how those programs are being administered, whose voices are being heard, and to what ends are these programs being put at the local level.
I think you also talk about how the nature of these partnerships moves them away from politics, not necessarily in the more general sense, but in the actual practice of political power, the debates over politics in local areas, because they're insulated from the electoral system.
That's right, and that again, that goes back to the progressive era, the ways in which these public-private partnerships are insulated, and part of what I try to show in the 70s, 80s, and 90s is that for a whole range of actors, particularly the New Democrats, who I focus on from Bill Clinton and some of the DLC Democrats on up, view public-private partnerships in the wake of the politics of the welfare rights movement in the 1970s and the sort of expansion of the minority rights revolution in the 1970s and these insurgent groups who are making claims on the state. They view public-private partnerships as a way of sort of depoliticizing access to these still fairly momentous forms of federal spending. And by the end, I show in the epilogue that in fact the public-private partnership and developmental supply-side logics that had informed this liberal mode of state building throughout the 20th century becomes sort of key to how Clinton views ending welfare entirely, that what we're going to put up in its place, this contentious issue that has been a thorn in the side of centrist Democrats for 20 years at the time that he signs away the New Deal's welfare programs, is to take those subsidies and offer them to businesses who hire people who have been out of work and to jawbone them into doing so. And so it's a sort of similar logic, but the idea, as he says, is to drain the politics from welfare by moving it into the market rather than the public sphere.
And this is a point that Mark Rose and Roger Biles developed in their book about downtown that I interviewed him a while ago there, where, with all this money around now, especially with the reforms that you talk about there, there's all sorts of ways you can fix up the downtown under that kind of logic there. But part of that, the absence of participation, is that the neighborhoods are loose out in that funding there. And Dustin Jenkins talks about this in bonds and all that. I mean, it has implications that go past what you're saying, that things are structured in a manner, especially the financial arrangement, structured in a manner which ties the state's hand financially to have to do certain kinds of things.
Yeah, and one of the other things that I think is really interesting here that sort of I think helps to begin explaining, and there's lots more work, historical work that needs to be done on this, but one of the really interesting things about the community action and the war on poverty moment, this maximum feasible participation, is that, even as Lyndon Johnson and then Richard Nixon after him moved to foreclose meaningful, grassroots participation in these types of programs, the sort of ideal of participation holds on. And so what we start to see over the course of the 1970s and 1980s is both business people and politicians offering highly managed forms of participation, where in a city like Cleveland, neighborhood groups are brought in and are confronted with the austerity of the Reagan era and are invited to decide which things to cut themselves, right? And so there's a way in which then the sort of participation holds on as a way of sort of releasing some of those pressures from community groups, so that business people and their political allies can get back to the work of those downtown developments that you were just talking about, right? So there's sort of a really strange little political half-life of participation that holds on in a neoliberal era.
Well, great. Well, talk to me about Hagley and what you got from our sources here in writing this book.
Yeah, so I mentioned that the National Association of Manufacturers Records, that sort of inflection point of the 1970s was really important to me in recognizing this divergence between local and national business politics. And so that's part of it. But I think the other piece that happens here, thinking in particular about the Chamber of Commerce, they get very close, and the Chamber of Commerce records at Hagley made this very clear to me. They become very close with the Nixon administration. And so as the Nixon administration is proposing what he calls his new federalism reforms, where he's going to take liberal programs like urban renewal and the war on poverty, and he's going to strip them of all their regulations, but keep the money and distribute the money in block grants to local governments. What Nixon does is he partners with Arch Booth and leaders of the Chamber of Commerce on a series of videos. They do a series of national television broadcast, simulcast TV, sort of conferencing, proto-Zoom calls with local chambers of commerce all across the country. And they're saying, we need you to come in and take over the administration of all of these, big statist liberal programs, right? As if those business people hadn't been there all along, right? And so that really puts into perspective for me that public-private partnership. And one of the things that it did was it caused me to look afresh at, perhaps the most famous memo of business politics and the rise of neoliberalism, which is this Powell memo, right? That Lewis Powell writes before he is appointed to the Supreme Court by Richard Nixon. He's a corporate attorney, represents R.J. Reynolds in Richmond, Virginia. And the Powell memo, Jane Mayer for the New Yorker, all sorts of scholars have used this text. This is a secret memo that he writes for the U.S. Chamber of Commerce, calling for business people to go on the march and to get more involved in politics. And it's often been invoked as this sort of as the signal call for sort of neoliberalization, that what we need is to move in and hollow out the state. And what the Chamber of Commerce involvement with the Nixon administration caused me to do was to actually figure out who it was that invited Powell to write the memo. And so there's this guy named Eugene Sidner, so he sends the memo to Eugene Sidner, who's the director of education programming for the U.S. Chamber of Commerce. And I was like, well, who is this guy, Eugene Sidner? And it turns out he's a regional retailer, department store owner from Richmond to Newport News, Virginia. And he's had 20 years building industrial development planning bodies in Virginia. He is a member of the Richmond Chamber of Commerce. He's precisely the kind of business person that I've been writing about. And part of what I see here is they talk about the American system of business and governance.
Hmm.
And part of what I try to say is that, yeah, some more, libertarian or anti-statist business people may have taken Powell's memo as a call to sort of, shrink the state down till it could be, drowned in a bathtub or whatever the line is. But part of what I actually think is happening here is that Sidner asked his friend Lewis Powell to write this memo in a way to sort of create a language that would continue to authorize state business partnerships in an era of new left criticism of corporations, in an era of growing regulation, to sort of mobilize business producerism on behalf of a privileged relationship with the state. And so I think it has gone on to have numerous different lives and interpretations, but the actual relationship between the writer of the memo and the person who solicited it, I see very much fits with the types of politics that the book explains more broadly.
And so this is the Chamber of Commerce records here give you that.
Yeah, that's exactly right. Yeah.
And folks may not realize how much larger the Chamber of Commerce is than NAM. I mean, it's a much different,
Yes.
huge difference in scale between those organizations throughout, just budget and all that there. So, because the Chamber has all these local affiliates. So when the Chamber, moves, it has the capacity to reach business people in a much broader way than NAM does. And there's your network right there.
That's right. And I think the and there's tension in the same way that NAM has in any federated organization around, does NAM view their members and their affiliates as shock troops to carry out the national vision, or do they view themselves as serving as lobbyists for the local affiliates? And that tension is never fully one direction or the other.
Well, very good. I'm glad, Hag, we can help you out. And also, you've been to some conferences, you've given some papers, you've done a few other things here. So
absolutely,
we're able to support you now. You're a neighbor down at
I am.
University of Pennsylvania. So we'll have to get you back up here for some more things, Brent.
You can count on it.
But thank you. I think this has been a great conversation. I could talk for much longer, but maybe we need to do it over beer rather than at part of this there. I hope you all will read his book. Take a look at Illusions of Progress, about this rethinking, if you will, of state business in the 20th century, if I can put it that way. And we'll continue to come back here and hear more Hadley History Hangouts about some of the great work done in our collection, some of which you've heard about today. So thank you, Brent. Thank you all for listening, and we'll see you again at the Hadley History.
Thank you so much, Roger.